There's been a lot of talk lately about the 70-20-10 model. I'm just wondering how your model relates to it, if it does at all.
Yes, the 70-20-10 model, you are hearing a lot about that at the moment, and for anybody that hasn't heard of it, the idea is that 70% of what you learn is essentially experiential, which maps, of course, completely across to my model. 20% is essentially through social experiences, which cuts, in fact, across many aspects of the model that I lay out. And then the 10% is the formal, which of course is exactly the same as the formal in my model. I don't regard these as competitive models. What the 70-20-10 is essentially saying is recognizing, is in a very generalized form that there's a lot more to learning than what takes place in the classroom or in any other sort of formal learning, and that experiential learning is very important. That has to be a very important statement to make. I would contest that you can say that 70-20-10 is actually applicable in every situation, because in some situations the formal element might be a lot higher or a lot lower, or the experiential or the social elements might be higher or lower. Nor do I think that you can actually use it as a prescription, because, again, every situation is different. There's an awful lot of difference working as a tele-sales operator, or a shop assistant, or a doctor, or a web designer, or a journalist, or whatever they are. Or they're so different that I don't think you can generalise. So I find the 70-20-10 very helpful as a reminder of how important the non-formal and the experiential elements are. But I actually think that what you have to do for your particular audience could be very, very different from that.
So on-demand and experiential that you mentioned in your four contexts, to me could be thought of as informal learning, which you mentioned earlier on. What advice would you give to those who might be a bit sceptical about the role informal learning plays on an individual's performance?
I don't think anybody can be sceptical about the fact that informal learning happens. As I say in the book, informal learning is a very broad term, and in fact, it helps to be a bit more precise about than that, and to look at, I look at it in terms of non-formal learning and on-demand and experiential. But I think where there's a lot of skepticism is about what essentially somebody in learning development can do to in any way influence or control that. It's always happened, and I don't think anybody, if you ask them, would pretend that they hadn't learned a great deal outside what they'd learned from formal education or formal training. But I think a lot of people in learning development are quite sceptical, or to be honest, I think actually a little bit anxious about what their role might be beyond that, because that hasn't historically been the situation. But in fact, if you don't consider the less formal elements of learning, then you're never going to be comfortable that what you're doing is really going to work, because you might run a very good classroom course, or create a very good piece of e-learning, or write a very good book. But of course, learning task is never going to be finished at the end of that course, or the end of someone reading that book. That's in many cases just a catalyst, and you can't. You feel that you've done your job properly, in my mind, if you haven't schemed out, at least in some way, how that's going to be followed on, and people are going to actually be able to put that into practice and improve their performance. So somehow or other, we've got to be more mindful of learning than just the formal elements.
Thanks, Clive. So what advice would you give to those who are wanting to try and measure informal learning then?
Well, it's always much harder to measure something that takes place outside a formal course, because you don't have control over all the elements. Obviously, in a course, you've got control over the curriculum, you've got control over the means of assessment. Although even then, we know that in fact everybody's going to come out of a particular formal event with a very different outcome in terms of learning, and they're going to make very different use of that. But nevertheless, at least that's a sort of reasonably controlled set of circumstances. And if you're going to evaluate anything, in any strict form, then you need to be in control of all the variables that might determine the outcome. That's much, much harder to accomplish with anything that's not a formal course, because of the fact that lots of other issues impact on someone's performance over and above learning, like their motivation or the clarity of their objectives or the achievability of those objectives or the way they're managed or the tools that they have at their disposal or the feedback they're given and so on. So there are lots of other things get in the way. But I would say that we don't need to beat ourselves up about this, because in a way there is a very simple measure in the end of performance, and performance is really what we're interested in. Is you've only got to ask someone's manager whether somebody is doing their job as is needed, and you know that whether you've been successful or not. The fact that you can't unpick how much of that was essentially due to learning as opposed to some other factor, or how much of the learning was formal as opposed to informal, shouldn't discourage you from taking some role in encouraging informal learning, as long as you are actually making an effort to measure performance, or at least measuring it indirectly by asking managers whether they feel that performance is up to scratch.
Thanks very much, Clive.